This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather in Washington and Connie Chung in New York.
Good evening. The lame duck House of Representatives here at the Capitol in Washington is voting at this hour on the Evolutionary World Pact called GATT, short for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This landmark treaty cuts tariffs, quotas, and subsidies here and in a lot of places, but it also sets up a powerful and controversial bureaucracy. Chief Washington correspondent Bob Schieffer is following the vote. Bob?
Dan, it's going to be a few more minutes before they finish counting the votes, but supporters of the agreement are building up a big lead. It appears they are going to give the president this victory, a big political victory, in a season when he hasn't had very many. Speaker of the House Tom Foley, who lost his own seat in the Republican landslide, arrived before dawn to carry the administration colors one last time.
For us not to approve GATT, I think, would be a signal blow, not only obviously to the GATT agreement, but to the role of leadership of the United States.
The White House dispatched its top guns, and they were needed. After thrashing the Democrats in November, Republicans conceded some in their party were not all that anxious to help the president now.
While a few members are concerned about giving President Clinton a victory, it seems to me that an overwhelming majority recognize that we're prepared to do that because President Clinton is right on this issue.
The debate itself was almost superfluous. It's hard to break new ground on an issue that's been negotiated for 12 years, but opponents said Congress still didn't know what it was voting on.
Over 2,000 pages.
Pro-labor forces said it would cost jobs. Rhetoric did not exactly soar.
You're jumping into the same cesspool, being seduced into the same ideology.
But supporters said passing GATT helped everyone and killing it carried a penalty.
But if this GATT fails, I can assure you the stock market will drop, support free trade, support lower taxes, support the expansion of the American dream.
And Dan, in the end, that view prevailed. I'm told that they have just gone over the top. It is passed. It will be much closer when it comes to a vote in the Senate next week or later this week, but supporters think it'll pass there too. Dan?
Thanks, Bob. Headline of the hour, GATT passes the House. Another important issue in the Congress and about Congress came up for argument today, but the main action on it wasn't here on Capitol Hill, not at the Capitol anyway. It was over there at the U.S. Supreme Court. The subject, term limits. Whether it is constitutional to limit by law the number of times a member of Congress can seek re-election. Correspondent Jim Stewart has our report.
Congressional term limits, the most popular political initiative in a decade, went before the Supreme Court today, and nobody was watching closer than members of Congress.
I think that I should be term limited, and I would like to go and say that on the record. I've always believed that I should be term limited. Every member here should be term limited.
Well, I'd be a hypocrite if I were for term limits. I'm in my 20th year.
Since 1990, 22 states have imposed limits on how many years a person may serve in the U.S. House or Senate. Today, the justices heard a challenge to the Arkansas term limit law. Arkansas Attorney General Winston Bryant said all his state was trying to do was to encourage rotation in office.
There's really nothing new about term limits. The Constitution limits the president to 2 terms. Many states already have restrictions on their governors. The question here is whether states can also limit the number of times a member of the U.S. Congress can serve.
Voters love term limits laws, most of which would restrict senators to 2 terms and representatives to no more than 6. But by those rules, more than 40% of the current lame duck House would be barred from running again. Opponents say that's unfair.
We're here, too, to protect voters' rights, the voters' rights to make their decision at the polls. We have term limits, and they're called elections. We need more options, not fewer.
Republicans say they'll bring up a national term limits law for a vote by June, just about the time the Supreme Court is expected to rule whether the state laws are legal or not. Jim Stewart, CBS News, Washington.
By the way, for whatever you may think it's worth, a new CBS News poll out tonight indicates term limits remain a popular issue with the public. 2/3 in our survey said they favored limiting service in Congress to 12 consecutive years. This poll also indicates that passage of health insurance reform is still public priority number 1. Ironically, this comes as First Lady Hillary Clinton is trying to redefine her role after taking heavy criticism for pushing hard on health insurance reform. Correspondent Linda Douglas has more now on the First Lady factor.
During the presidential campaign, Mr. Clinton told voters if they elected him, they would get 2 Clintons for the price of 1. But according to our CBS News poll, Mrs. Clinton's role as a policymaker has rankled voters. For the first time, her negative ratings are as high as her positive ratings.
By choosing an inside policy role, she made everything much more complicated for herself.
After her efforts as head of the unsuccessful Clinton health care program, more than half of Americans say it's not appropriate for first ladies to make policy. And the health care policy damaged the president politically by undermining his claim to be a new, more moderate Democrat.
I believe that the Clinton proposal, which was too complex and convoluted, which reeked of big government, labeled the president as an old Democrat.
It's unclear what role Mrs. Clinton will play next. Lately, she's been seen in more traditional settings, as White House hostess and decorating the national Christmas tree. But while traveling with the president in Indonesia, she remained politically combative. In a radio interview, she questioned how much the Republican Congress will accomplish.
I don't know what is talk and what is action. I have learned in my many years of observing politics, there is a huge gap between the two.
Advisors are urging Mrs. Clinton to focus on children's issues, already one of her passions and a traditional First Lady's cause. But most who know her say she will not be forced to stand on the sidelines.
You can't take that passion, that fight, that personality out of you unless you're truly muzzled. But Hillary Clinton can't suddenly shift herself into something that she's not.
Tonight in a speech, Mrs. Clinton will outline what she now thinks her role should be. Sources say she's keeping an eye on White House efforts to come up with a new health care plan, but it's unlikely that she'll be involved in crafting the details. Linda Douglas, CBS News, Washington.
Just ahead, as the CBS Evening News continues, the latest on the condition of Dan Quayle, hospitalized with a blood clot in his lung. And a jailed nurse answers charges that patients in her care died of unnatural causes. For any politician, especially a presidential hopeful, political health and medical health can be closely connected. Tonight, there is word that Dan Quayle, the former vice president, who is likely to make a presidential bid in 1996, is now being treated for a dangerous blood clot in his lung. CBS News health correspondent Dr. Bob Arnott has the details.
It was a close call for former Vice President Dan Quayle, who was admitted to University Hospital in Indianapolis last night after a blood clot lodged in his lung. Today, doctors say he's expected to recover.
Within 6 months to 1 year, his lung function should be back to normal.
Like most blood clot patients, Quayle's diagnosis was not made right away. On Sunday, he was evaluated for pneumonia, but was not admitted to the hospital until yesterday evening when he experienced increasing shortness of breath. Blood clots almost always form in a leg vein. When the clot breaks loose, it travels through the veins into the lung, knocking out part of its ability to work and leaving the patient suddenly short of breath. Doctors dissolve the blood clot by administering a blood thinner called heparin. It's estimated that 500,000 Americans suffer blood clots each year. However, most already suffer from a chronic illness, clotting disorder, or are recovering from surgery. However, doctors say Quayle was in perfect health.
But it is unusual for a perfectly healthy person to suddenly present with a blood clot.
The former vice president had undertaken a heavy speaking and campaign schedule in recent months. Long periods of sitting in a cramped position in an airplane or a car could have led to a blood clot. There is still some risk to Dan Quayle from new blood clots and the use of blood thinners, which can cause bleeding. However, for now, doctors say this incident does not appear to pose a threat to any presidential aspirations Mr. Quayle might consider. Dr. Bob Arnott, CBS News, New York.
For 3 months, an Oklahoma woman who has been jailed on $1 million bond awaiting trial for murder. Alita Beach is alleged to have killed 4 patients in the hospital where she worked as a nurse. For the first time, Beach has spoken out about the deaths in an interview with correspondent Vicki Mabry in Chickasha, Oklahoma.
Alita Beach says she feels guilty about the 4 patients who died in her care last August.
On Friday night, there were 2 people who died. Saturday, 1, and then Sunday, 1. I felt guilty only in the part that I could have done something more.
But Beach is charged with killing those 4 terminally ill patients. She left a note indicating the possibility Goldie Crum was injected with potassium chloride, while the veins of Irene Mullins, Flossie Fair, and Daryl Ritchie may have been injected with air. After their deaths, Beach attempted suicide on a hospital ward and allegedly confessed to hospital staff.
After inquiring why did you try to attempt the suicide, she said, because I killed 4 people.
Alita Beach refuses to discuss the note that was found after her suicide attempt, but its contents were enough to convince the district attorney to convene a grand jury for the first time in 17 years in Grady County. Beach wants to convince the patients' families otherwise.
So we can truly say that none of these were mercy killings. She did not.
No. That's something I'd never thought about doing. I especially want the family members to know that I did not kill their patients in the hospital, because they're suffering already from the loss of a loved one, and then thinking that they've been murdered on top of that I want them to know that they were not.
Potassium chloride and air are virtually undetectable during autopsy, and the medical examiner could not find evidence of either in the 4 patients. But Daryl Ritchie's family wonders, was he killed?
Why would she write a note? Why would she try to commit suicide? I could very easily say guilty as charged. But would it be fair?
That's what a jury will have to decide when Beach is tried next year. Vicki Mabry, CBS News, Chickasha, Oklahoma.
Stay with us for more CBS News, including some Boston men who are suing their bosses for sex discrimination.
Not everyone can look like this, but is America unfair to fat people? She tried to buy a seat, but found out one ticket just wasn't enough.
I had a ticket to ride, and it didn't say anything about being a certain height or a certain weight.
Now she's fighting back, and she's not alone. But do they have a case? Eye on America tomorrow on the CBS Evening News.
Serbian forces were swaggering through Bosnia today, triumphant now that the U.S. has dropped its threat of military action to help the Muslim-led government. Tonight, the talk from Washington is of new peace talks and possible concessions that would give the Serbs their goal, a greater Serbia carved out of the former Yugoslavia. Correspondent Alan Pizzi is on the scene in Bosnia.
The word of the day in Bosnia was concession, but it could barely be heard above the noise of gunfire. The Bosnian Serbs showed no inclination to make concessions for peace in Bihać in spite of a furious round of diplomacy. The 5-nation Western Contact Group came to Sarajevo for talks with the Bosnian government, who have already signed on to their plan, but not the Serbs, who haven't. The Bosnian Serbs reject the peace map because it gives them 49% of Bosnia. They control 70% and are steadily adding to that. The contact group disavowed suggestions made by Clinton administration officials that long-standing U.S. policy against letting the Bosnian Serbs form a confederation with Serbia could be reversed.
We stick with the plan. We insist that the map be accepted, and we believe that this is a viable plan to achieve peace in this part of the world.
But Washington keeps floating its new trial balloon.
Yeah, I said we would be willing to consider that change. It's on the table.
The Bosnian government totally rejects any change.
There is no room anymore for concession. We said yes so many times.
And from the battleground came another voice vowing no concessions. And just in case anyone thought the Bosnian Serbs were impressed, they demanded NATO flight plans for patrols over Bosnia in exchange for British and Dutch peacekeepers they hold hostage. No concessions are expected there either. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Sarajevo.
In Vietnam, the hellhole prison once known as the Hanoi Hilton is making way for a real hotel. Ground was broken today for a luxury building on the site. The name Hanoi Hilton came from U.S. prisoners of war who were tortured there during the Vietnam War. Its new name will be the Hanoi Towers, a 22-story hotel and office complex financed by a Singapore company. Here in Washington, the House Ethics Committee met behind closed doors today to consider a complaint against House Speaker-to-be Newt Gingrich. At issue, an accusation by Democrats that Gingrich misused his staff for highly partisan political purposes. After today's session, the Ethics Committee said it needs more information before proceeding. Gingrich says the complaint is, and I quote him now, nonsense. In a one-on-one interview, Gingrich also told me he understands that his reputation for playing politics hard, tough, and often negative makes him a target for counterattacks.
I think there's a almost fervent effort by some media institutions to prove that in some way I'm a hypocrite. I'm not a saint. I mean, I'm a pretty normal person.
Speaking of normal persons, you said at one point, and this is a paraphrase, but I think an accurate one, that President and Mrs. Clinton did not represent and were not normal people.
Well, what I said was, and I'm perfectly happy to talk about it, is that the policies of this administration are felt by, I think, normal Americans as threatening. Normal in the sense if you're a working middle-class person, the tax increases scare you. If you're Catholic and you hear the Surgeon General overtly anti-Catholic in some of her statements, that jars you. If you are a strong military person, the gaze and military policy jarred you. And I was simply trying to describe what I sense both in polling data and in talking to individuals, this sense of being threatened by an administration and a system that isn't responsive to working middle-class Americans, to small business, to the concerns of people who make up the vast majority of America.
I think you'll agree that if you said Newt Gingrich in Washington, and for that matter around the country, a lot of people would have said, and probably still would say, bomb thrower. My question now is, how do you see yourself coming into this new job? Still the bomb thrower?
When you're the minority in the House, you have to use every possible device to have some impact, because the House is designed to make the majority very effective. It's very different from the Senate. This is the first time a Republican speaker could sit down with Republican chairmen and say, gee, what positive hearings should we have? What positive bills should we bring to the floor? And I think none of us have made that adjustment. I mean, all of us over the next 60 days are going to have to go through a sort of re-education of ourselves. It's a pretty big learning experience, and my guess is occasionally we're going to fall on our face. I mean, occasionally you're going to look, you can't make the transition this big and be totally elegant. I don't think it's possible.
As for how he sees his role and his style changing when he goes from Republican whip to Speaker of the whole House and one of the most powerful men in the country in January, Gingrich told me, and I quote him, it's like going from middle linebacker to head coach. Connie?
Jerry Rubin, a key player in the turbulent counterculture and anti-war movement of the 1960s, died overnight at UCLA Medical Center in California. Rubin was hit by a car 2 weeks ago jaywalking. He never recovered. Back in the 60s, Rubin sported wild hair and revolutionary rhetoric. He helped galvanize an army of anti-Vietnam War protesters at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. He and 7 others were charged with conspiracy to incite a riot. By the mid-70s, Rubin had some regrets.
Sometimes the rhetoric was excessive, and the 60s were male chauvinist, and in many ways we were the victims of our own conditioning, and we did become the thing we were opposed to. But we can be very proud that we opposed the war that almost now everybody agrees was wrong.
In later years, Rubin traded his tie-dyes for suits and ties, from street protest to Wall Street. And then to California to market a health tonic. It was a long, strange trip from the 60s and from Rubin's motto, don't trust anyone over 30. Jerry Rubin was 56.
Here in Washington, the U.S. Postal Rate Commission for your post office is pushing the edge of the envelope again. Tomorrow, the commission is expected to recommend that postage for a first-class letter go from the current 29 cents to 32 cents beginning in January. However, the commission's recommendation still needs final approval from the Postal Service Board of Governors.
They call themselves the Boston Eight. They're victims, they say, of discrimination in the workplace. Stereotyped because of their sex, bumped off the fast track to success, and finally ground down by a system that was stacked against them. Correspondent Jacqueline Adams has their story.
A few years ago, Joe Egan and Tracy Tinkham hoped they were on the management fast track at the Jenny Craig Weight Loss Company. Now they claim they ran smack into a glass ceiling just because they're men.
It was the way that people were treated, men were treated in order to climb the ladder. They just didn't want men in a management position because they didn't fit into a clique.
Egan and Tinkham are two of the so-called Boston Eight, all of whom are suing Jenny Craig in part because they say this is what they heard.
If you wanted to get anywhere in the company, you would have to have a sex change or buy a push-up bra.
In his formal complaint, Egan charged that unlike female employees, he was intimidated, demoted, and given unreasonable performance goals. Once the manager of a Jenny Craig center, Egan now works part-time as a bartender.
5 years of my desire to step ahead. I mean, if I would have taken that energy that I had and channeled it somewhere else, I could be so much better off at this stage.
Jenny Craig officials refused to appear on camera, but in a written statement, officials strongly denied the Boston Eight's allegations and labeled the claims frivolous.
Yet experts say now that women make up 43% of all managers, they are just as capable of abusing their power as men are. Indeed, 1 out of every 7 sexual discrimination suits is filed by a man.
They bring right along with them the same problem that power always brings. And power corrupts men, power corrupts women, power corrupts everybody. The purpose of the laws is to put a brake on that corrupting process.
Jenny Craig promises a new way to think about food. This case, though, may teach Americans a new way to think about discrimination. Jacqueline Adams, CBS News, New York.
And that's tonight's CBS Evening News. Tomorrow on CBS This Morning with Harry Smith and Paula Zahn, an interview from London about Bosnia policy with Bob Dole, the likely new U.S. Senate Majority Leader.
And Dan and I will see you again tomorrow night. From all of us at CBS News, good night. Good night, Dan.
Good night, Connie. Good night, everyone.
Experience CBS News. This is CBS.